This video contains spoilers for Tignari's first story quest as well as the Aranyaka questline. Proceed at your own peril if you have not completed these. Every time a new Ruin robot comes out, someone inevitably feels compelled to say, Celestia did nothing wrong. Because, you know, Celestia nuked Khaenri'ah, and that's where all these robots come from. I've heard this phrase a lot since arriving in Sumeru, mostly because of these giant Ruin Titans, and like, okay, I get it, it's a little understandable. Those things are pretty scary, but I can't help but find myself on the opposite side of this debate. I'm actually convinced that Khaenri'ah was the one that did nothing wrong. Khaenri'ah did nothing wrong. But what about those crazy robots? Listen, they're not as bad as you think, and I'm pretty sure they're not the reason why Khaenri'ah got nuked. I don't think the robots were even built for the purpose of fighting Celestia at all. As far as I'm concerned, there was no war against heaven, at least not where Khaenri'ah was involved. The destruction of Khaenri'ah was an accident. This might sound like a hot take, but grab a snack and stick around. I'll walk you through the evidence. The idea that Khaenri'ah may have not been Celestia's enemy came about when I was mulling over the factions that formed after the cataclysm. I couldn't quite figure out why the survivors of Khaenri'ah didn't form at least some semblance of an alliance with each other. Why were they so focused on these individual goals with no space to interact with each other? Now, up until this point, we've been led to believe that Khaenri'ah was actively at war with Celestia, so having Celestia retaliate or destroy their homeland should have convinced at least most of the survivors to band together in some way, right? But that's not exactly what happened. Instead of having some sort of intermingling alliance of former Khaenri'ahns, we ended up with these three distinct factions of surviving Khaenri'ahns that aren't Hilichurls and Metaturls and all that other kind of stuff, right? We ended up with the Fatui, the Abyss Order, and Dainsleif. And of course, we do have Rhindaughter, who seems to be off doing her own thing, and then there's whatever the flip-floppery Kaia's family is doing, but we're going to ignore those two for now and just focus on the first three, because the other two are kind of mysterious and I don't know what's going on with them. So the Fatui, while not made up of Khaenri'ahns entirely, is led by Piero, who appears to have been a person of some importance to the royal family of Khaenri'ah, whose advice was completely ignored prior to the cataclysm. The Abyss Order, on the other hand, is more or less what I would expect from a Khaenri'ahn revenge army, minus the monstrous mutations, anyway. But then there's Dainsleif, the alleged traitor, according to the Abyss Twin, and decidedly the most neutral of the three factions, although he is actively working against the Abyss Order, lest they mess up a delicate neutral balance within Teyvat, or at least that's my take. Now, I know this seems kind of like a small sample size of the population, and it kind of is, but you gotta remember, there weren't that many survivors, so I'm gonna roll with this because everyone else appears to be a Hilichurl. So, yeah. Anyway, motives-wise, it seems like the Fatui wants to create a brand new world and leave Teyvat behind, while the Abyss Order seems to want to just destroy everything, including Teyvat, but possibly revive Khaenri'ah, I guess. And then there's Dainsleif, who doesn't seem to want anything to change from its current position. But there seems to be a pretty big disconnect here with Celestia's involvement. Like, yes, the Abyss Order does want to fight Celestia with a giant artificial robot god thing, but Piero and Dainsleif were also present, and neither have their anger focused on Celestia exactly. Piero doesn't seem to care about what happens to the gods or Celestia so long as he gets the gnosis that he ordered, and Dainsleif tells us not to challenge them nor trust them. If war between Khaenri'ah and Celestia was really a thing, wouldn't these guys be a little bit more hostile? Wouldn't Dainsleif's warnings be different, and wouldn't Piero be more like, hey, murder the Archons, you don't have to negotiate with Baal for like months on end, you can just, you know, kill her and take the gnosis. Like, I'm confused about that part. But this is what got me thinking that Khaenri'ah might not have ever actually been at war with Celestia. In fact, I think they might share an enemy. I think Khaenri'ah was at war with the Abyss. Okay. So in the Aranyaka quest, we learned a lot of stuff, but the most notable thing we learned was about the concept of Marana. So Marana is basically what the Aranara call the memory of death that exists within the Irminsul, which is basically the giant tree of memories whose roots make up the ley lines that cover the entire world, right? Marana is said to be one with the monsters like the Rift Hounds, which we know are abyssal monsters, making it very likely that Marana is deeply connected to, or is, the Abyss. Now, In Sumeru, Marana most commonly manifests as withering zones, area where all life is leached away from the earth, plants become infected with corrupted miasmic tumors, and monsters get more aggressive in their attempts to kill you. Nothing grows in the withering zones, which is why they need to be cleansed lest they destroy the entire forest. The Aranara say that at one point, Marana could turn everything into Veluca, which means sand, and that Sumeru was once a massive desert with no forest at all. And things don't really grow that well in the desert, now do they? They could be often described as barren. You know what else is described that way? Khaenri'ah. Khaenri'ah is described as an underground nation that is quite barren where nothing much of note grows. And remember that Khaenri'ah is also an underground nation, and we know that the further we go underground, the closer we get to the Abyss. And since we know that the Abyss and Marana are linked, is it not reasonable to suggest that Khaenri'ah could have just actually been a massive withering zone? Like, hear me out for a second. Khaenri'ah's lands were so barren that not much would grow. They relied on a special form of alchemy just to survive. This barrenness would make a lot more sense if it was caused by Marana, because Khaenri'ah was definitely advanced enough to at least make an artificial sun like Enkanomiya to grow things. Light was definitely not a problem for a nation that was underground. So what was? And then we've got these robots that Khaenri'ah made, right? A lot of robots. And what were they made for? Dainsleif said that the land had to be tilled with steel and blood, which makes sense for a country that's perpetually at war, so these robots were most certainly made for just that. But why robots? No other nation has seen the need to develop a robot army when a human or demigod army will do the job. We've also not seen any other type of robot besides the Khaenri'ah type, so it's not like it was a mecha versus mecha, you know? So what we're left with is a nation with a culture built around warfare that decides to build a completely autonomous robot army, not because they want to play Metabots, but because robots were better suited to fight the enemy that they were facing, right? So why might that be? I propose that it was because the enemy was death itself. Marana, the Abyss. And we know that exposure to the Marana and the Abyss can really screw a person up. Less so if they have a vision, but even then it can still kill quite quickly, making it difficult for humans to face it head on. Against an opponent this toxic, a robot army is perfectly sensible. Robots aren't alive, so they can't exactly die when touched by the memory of death, right? So suddenly the idea that the land is tilled with steel and blood makes a whole lot more sense. This was never a statement of aggression or the lingering resentment of a war against the gods. This was a statement of survival. This might feel like it came out of left field a little bit, but there's new evidence in Sumeru that supports this hypothesis. The giant ruin titan in Sumeru has a bunch of little notes that you can read that paint a very striking picture of its role in the cataclysm. Basically, with the exception of one note that follows the story of Zandig, these mysterious chronicles talk about the soldiers that operated the Titan. But one of them explicitly states that these same soldiers were fighting the onslaught of dark beasts. This is a huge revelation because it means that Khaenri'ah did not bring the abyssal monsters to the surface to attack Celestia. Khaenri'ah was already locked in combat against the Abyss when something went horribly wrong and the monsters broke through their front lines. Khaenri'ah would have either been forced to retreat to the surface or may have even been in pursuit. It's hard to say. Now, before we swap gears to talk about Celestia's decision to nuke, I want to look at one other incident with this newfound perspective that we have. Specifically, I want to look at the robots littered around Dragonspine. I know that seems like a bit of a leap. But anyway, at least 2,600 years ago, the civilization of Solvindignir on Dragonspine had their Irminsul tree destroyed when Celestia dropped a nail on it. This also destroyed the civilization that lived there, but Celestia's reasons for the nuke are never stated. It's not ever stated if it was intentional either, or if it was just an accident. It could have been either. What's interesting is that even though we know Khaenri'ah robots existed 3,000 years ago from their presence within Guizhong's domain, which we won't go into right now, the mountain is littered with robots that were never mentioned in any of the texts from the time period of 2,600 years ago, which means they arrived much later. In fact, they arrived post-nuke. Not that that's particularly specific. Now, if you've ever gotten curious and investigated any of these robots, you'll notice that a bunch of them just display this weird cryptic gibberish binary type code, right? Now, it turns out this gibberish is actually a cipher, and when decoded, the complete cipher reads, "For the nation we can't forego this skyborn power, but we failed." This message outright states that these robots had a mission to obtain the Skyfrost nail for the sake of Khaenri'ah. They cannot do without it, but unfortunately they failed to obtain it for reasons that are never stated. But that's really odd. Whatever could Khaenri'ah have wanted the celestial nail for? Well, might I turn your attention to this video I made on the nail in the chasm? If you haven't seen it or it's been a while, here's the conclusion I came to within that video. I concluded that the dark mud is corrupted, toxic waste from the ley lines, and that the celestial nail has the natural propensity to repel or cleanse it. If you want the full explanation about why and how I reached this conclusion, you can watch the video. But in the meantime, I would like to point out that during the cataclysm, Sumeru not only experienced a black sky and rain, but it also experienced a surge of black mud, same as in the chasm. And the Aranyaka refer to this mud and rain as the result of the Mirana. Some of you probably already know where I'm going with all of this. In fact, let me paint you a picture of what I think really happened. I think Khaenri'ah was more or less a gigantic withering zone. Perhaps not when it was first established, but I think it definitely got worse over time. Because nothing would grow, they relied on their unique art of chemia for everything they needed. The thing is, alchemy, and therefore chemia, uses the power of the ley lines in order to complete transmutations. Ley lines are the roots of the Irminsul tree, and we know that Mirana is considered an infection within this life-giving tree. Imagine that the survival of your entire civilization depends on this tree alone, and you learn that it's infected and it could die. Of course you'd try to cure the tree. You'd fight every monster in your path, and you'd try to find ways to stop the bleeding as best you could. You'd probably manage to hold the line for a long time, but eventually, something's gotta give. Now imagine that King Irmin of Khaenri'ah, the king of the last dynasty, the Eclipse dynasty, heard about this power of the heavens, this celestial nail, with its unique ability to repel and purify the abyssal corruption like it did in the chasm. That sounds like it would be exactly the thing they needed to tip the scales of war in their favor. They just needed to retrieve it. So, a brigade of autonomous robots was sent to Dragonspine to try and retrieve the nail, but the mission failed for some unexplained reason. But without the power of the nail, Khaenri'ah was likely overwhelmed and lost control of the flow of monsters, which spilled out into Teyvat. This left Celestia with no choice but to hurl a nail at the source of the monsters, the nation of Khaenri'ah, just like it had done in the Chasm and Solvindignir. And that's why the Dendro Archon disappeared during the Cataclysm to try and heal the tree. That's why Makoto said that they couldn't ignore what was happening in Khaenri'ah. But wait, I hear you thinking about it. Why did all of the Khaenri'ahs turn into Hilichurls then? Who cursed them? Who cursed Dane with immortality? What happened there? If Celestia wasn't aiming for Khaenri'ah, if they didn't have a gripe against them, if they weren't trying to punish Khaenri'ah, then who cursed them all, and why? Curses that happen above the level of gods or Celestia even just baffle me, and Dainsleif even says that his curse takes place at a higher level of reality, which is confusing, because it would be a higher level of reality than even the highest level of gods. I don't know how that works. And remember, it's not just Dainsleif and the Hilichurls that are cursed. The Seelies are cursed too, which is odd because Seelies were supposed to be like a divine race that answered to the Moon Sisters, which, as far as we know, outranked Celestia, or at least were at the same rank of Celestia and the Archons, and were therefore the highest levels of divinity known at the time, with the exception of the Primordial One and its shades, although it's very possible that the Moon Sisters were shades, but that's another video entirely. The Seelies did a thing that was blessed by the highest known authority in Teyvat, who would go on to curse them for this exact same act. Who has that kind of power? And the answer, like everything else, is Mirana. Of course, that means that Mirana has some level of sentience, and yeah, I think that's probably the case. Because do you remember how at the very beginning of the game, the Abyss Order was trying to steal this fictional book, The Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies, and how they claimed it contained this big secret, and they were surprised that we just wanted a stolen library book and we didn't want the secret at all? Well, the first character in this book, in the volume that we received, is called the Night Mother. She's described as cruel, with no heart and no mouth. She's dwelling in the darkness where abhorrent creatures lived and where no tree could ever grow. Now, only volume 1 of 7 is available to us, but based on this volume alone, and the fact that her body may or may not have been made up of mud, and she may or may not have had the tendency for cursing people, wink wink, nudge nudge, we can deduce that the Night Mother is closely connected to the Abyss, or the Marana, whatever you want to call it. Now, that is not to say that I think Marana is a person, but remember that the Aranara say that the Marana has many avatars, including the one that we fought at the end of the Aranyaka quest. They even suggest that the Abysslings are all, in some ways, avatars of Marana. They are those who accepted Marana into their hearts and carry out its will. There's a lot of parallels to the Night Mother and the Pale Princess, okay? Because notice how the avatar of Marana that we fought looks to be made of dark sludge, and that reminds me even more of something like Durin. What if he started out as a normal dragon but got corrupted by Marana? That would totally explain why his internal thoughts, as written in the Skyward Weapons and the Festering Desire, read so happy and positive. It's because Durin was originally a normal, friendly dragon that became infected with Marana and then lost control of himself. And if I'm right, and the Marana and the Night Mother are the same entity, then Marana should have similar characteristics to the Night Mother, right? And if the Night Mother has a tendency to curse things, then it makes sense that Marana would also curse things. And since Marana is the memory of death, it would also make sense that her curses revolved around the concept of death. So, what if she, I don't know, cursed a whole race of humans to walk the world in an undead state, lingering at the point between life and death forever until they simply fade away? Well, you'd have just described the Hilichurls. We know from Dainsleif that this is what happened with them. And it could have also been what happened with the Seelies, but with elemental beings instead of humans. They were cursed to wither away until they were nothing more but empty husks. Who better than the Abyss itself to curse the most divine of all beings in heaven, In light of all this, I think the motives behind the 3 factions I talked about at the beginning of this video begin to make a little bit more sense. Piero likely believed that the Marana could not be defeated, and that the world was doomed anyway. But since the Marana infected the Irminsul, the source of all life, the only way forward was to create a new world with a new Irminsul and leave the old one to rot. It's possible that he believes this can be achieved by collecting the Gnosis and seizing some power of creation that Celestia supposedly has. That would explain why Piero doesn't really care about the fate of the gods themselves, pitiful, misguided things that they are. I think the Abyss Order, on the other hand, ended up accepting the inevitability of death and recognizing the power of Marana as more powerful than any other, and therefore embracing the fact that they could never win against it. They accepted the memory of death and became the avatars of Marana, not allowed to die until its will was carried out. And Marana desires the death of all things, including the gods. So that would explain why the Abyss Order has a target on Celestia's back, so to speak, when they didn't actually have so much of a grudge against them while they were actually alive as Khaenri'ahs. And as for Dainsleif, well, imagine a scenario where the influx of monsters became so bad that he was tasked with taking something like a bomb to the heart of the Marana to try and force it out of Irminsul, only to hesitate at the last second after having come in contact with the tree, realizing at that moment that life actually needs death just as death needs life. They are the light and the shadow, the yin and the yang. Khaenri'ah would fall one way or another, just a matter of time, but the world would live on. I think his neutrality towards the gods is because he doesn't actually agree with their methods of government, but he understands the necessity of it. Do not disturb the delicate balance, so to speak. And that's why he goes so hard against the Abyss Order. He's just trying to maintain the balance. The curious thing here is that the Traveler's sibling is siding with the Abyss Order here, and that the sibling is convinced that the Traveler will join their side once they learn the truth, whatever that truth happens to be. I always wondered why they thought this when all evidence points to the Abyss Order having questionable motives, or at least motives that I don't think the current iteration of the Traveler would ever fall in line with. But now I'm wondering if the truth that the twin came to discover was that Marana and Irminsul, the tree and the Abyss, they're the same thing. I don't know that they can actually be separated. The more I think about it, the more I realize that all aspects of Mirana, when thought of as a deity, as, like a personification, as in like a night mother, right? It lines up with the concept of a void goddess archetype. The Hindu goddess Kali is a great example of this archetype. She's a deity that is responsible for both the creation of everything as well as the destruction of everything. Everything that comes from the sea returns to the sea. It's like being at different ends of the Ouroboros. And when you start to realize the Chinese characters for the abyss overlap with the ones used for the term void, it's hard to ignore these similarities. If the Irminsul gives life, it makes sense for it to destroy life too. A tree can't grow forever, and if the twins are in fact related to the primordial one, as I suspect they are, then the truth of this world just might be that the twins cannot disobey the call of their kin. Because remember, the primordial one not only created the world from the three realms, but they stitched it all together with the flow of the elemental energy, with the flow of the ley lines. So the world the twins once thought was completely destroyed and never to be found again for thousands of years still lives, and the goal now may be to try and save it. One twin might be seeking salvation through destruction and perhaps rebirth, and the other may be seeking salvation with a power from beyond, courtesy of the snake ring constellation Dainsleif. Who will prevail in the end? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I am having a blast watching all of the pieces come together, and I hope you are too. I can't wait to hear your thoughts down in the comments, and members, a special thanks to you. You guys make my life so much easier. Really, you really do. You also made this video possible by helping to support our editor, the lovely TXR. So I will thank you on behalf of them as well. In any case, like all good robots, we gotta keep those engines running, guys, so don't forget to visit your regular maintenance personnel and always remember to oil your gears on a regular basis. Make sure to take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Laters!